talking. Go for it.
Good afternoon, folks, and welcome to today's Sustainable Change Alliance conversation. Our topic today is decarbonizing global energy, transportation, and industrial systems. That's a mouthful, and I'm looking forward to us actually diving into this, what I call literally the point of leverage for how we accomplish restoring our planet, which is sort of the theme for Earth Day. My name is John Glanville. I'm CEO and president of Maps.com. We are a proud founding sponsor of Sustainable Change Alliance Foundation, and we do maps. So if you're interested in getting a map, feel free to check out Maps.com. Sustainable Change Alliance is an impact-oriented, member-based, non-for-profit educational group. We basically are focused on impact investing, which we define as bringing financial and other resources to double and triple bottom line organizations, trying to address big social, environmental, health-related issues, and trying to do that in a sustainable manner. I like to underline sustainable. That's why I'm involved, is after years of working in the nonprofit sector and finding that you would put a lot of effort in and move the ball forward, and then things just seem to slide back. So the key is finding sustainable solutions. Some of these organizations are for profit, some are not for profit, and some come from the independent sector. I'd like to acknowledge the hardworking and dedicated Sustainable Change Alliance board members in the meeting. Oh, goodness. Stephen, how am I going to actually identify everybody if I can't see? I can see you, Stephen. I can see you, Jonathan. I can see you, Matthew. I think I can see Cheryl's there. Titus is there.
Richard
there. And Linda's there. So thank you for joining us today. I want to also thank all of our Sustainable Change Alliance members who have joined us for this call. And I want to extend a hearty thank you to our sponsors who include, and I'm going to start from the bottom up. So our silver sponsor is Brashears Insurance. Our platinum sponsor is Nixon Peabody Law Firm. Our founding sponsors include UBS, Solgenics, Impact Family Office, Argyle Family Capital Partners, and Maps.com. I want to say if you have not decided to join Sustainable Change Alliance Foundation by now, you should. We encourage you and your organization to join us on this journey. Visit sustainablechangealliance.org, where you can sign up as a member. And keep in mind, this is not the first of our conversations. We have a treasure trove of great content and material going back, I'm going to say, more than a year that we've been doing this. So lots of valuable discussions on a wide variety of sustainable topics. I want to touch on some logistics before we get started. The meeting is being recorded. All of you are on mute, except for Daniel. And there's a chat room, and this is how we bring questions to our guests. So feel free to weigh in with your thoughts, questions, impressions, and let's get started. Okay, I'm going to click that button to get that out of my way. I'm going to click that button to get that out of the way. And I learned today, I'm supposed to be looking at the camera, not looking at the screen. So I'll try and focus on the camera while also focusing on the primary job I have right now, is introducing a fascinating character named Daniel Palmer. One of the things I love about Santa Barbara is there are a lot of people who are really, really interesting. Daniel happens to be a deployment manager at OGCI Climate Investments, LLP. And he has a long and great career. And I was commenting, I can understand why OGCI chose Daniel, because of his broad and deep experience in the industries that are participants in OGCI. I'm going to let Daniel go into more detail on what is involved with OGCI. But I wanted to touch on two things. One is, it's not often we have an engineer on these calls, and I just wanted to thank, as a civil engineer, I wanted to thank Daniel for joining us today. He also happens to hold a patent for reducing axial wave reflections, and
you really have read my LinkedIn profile.
I really read it, and I was going to say, if we get stuck for questions, we will actually delve into this.
We'll delve into my patent history.
Yes, exactly. And yeah, Daniel's gotten compliments from across the industry that he has participated in. Excellent decision maker, strategic in his delivering and understanding of market and operational requirements, meeting demands in active markets. I can understand why he was chosen for his role with OGCI. So I'm going to leave it at that, unless there are any questions in terms of, I can get into Daniel's educational background if you'd like me to, but otherwise, why don't we turn it over to Daniel? And I think probably the first question is, tell us a little bit about your story. Tell us how you got to where you are today. Tell us, some people call it an origin story. I'm just going to say.
No, it's a good one. That's a good question. So, I was an engineer. I worked for Schlumberger. I actually grew up in the UK. You probably tell from my accent. I grew up in the north of England in a coal mining area. So it's very relevant to climate change. So when I was about 17, the local mine closed. And I think when I graduated from high school, it was 80% youth unemployment in my town, right? So luckily I went off to university, went off to Cambridge, did engineering. But it was very clear to me then that I wasn't going back to my hometown, right? I was going somewhere else. So when I graduated, I worked in a steel technology company in Sheffield when I was at university, and that convinced me I didn't want to work in the steel industry. And so I wanted just to go explore the world, adventure. So I joined. That's what the attraction of Schlumberger was. You go off to some distant place and go search for oil and gas in the middle of the jungle or desert. And sure enough, that's what I did. I ended up in Saudi Arabia straight out of university, doing oil exploration in the Empty Quarter and the Red Sea and all these kind of places. So fascinating. But I was fast forward a little further, sort of mid-90s, I'm working in Alaska. And I remember we were up on the North Slope in the middle of December at Christmas. And it should be -30 or -40, right? And it was raining. Right. And this was the first year, I think it was 99. We had a huge El Nino event. And I remember the natives who live up there said they'd never, ever seen rain in December, and it was clear, I'd been conscious of climate change. It never really struck home. And working on the North Slope in the 90s, they were starting to see unusual events. Right. And it started to become more and more an area of interest to me. So I was very interested in renewable energy, and I kind of followed the origins of solar power and wind power, but it didn't really have a lot of career options at that stage. It was like, if you wanted to go and do off-grid solar, you could kind of scrape a living doing that, but that was about it. So about 10 years ago, that interest got more and more, and I was working in the headquarters of Schlumberger on technology and marketing, and I was like, okay, all the things I'm working on are going to make it easier and cheaper to develop more and more and more oil and gas, and that's not the direction I want to go in. And finally, I was in the Middle East. I was the head of sales and marketing for the Middle East region, and an opportunity came along. I'd been searching, an opportunity came along to go and develop a huge solar project, to be the kind of lead for that. So it was a big step. I was going from, at the time, a booming oil and gas industry, vice president job, big company, to being the number two, the second person in the whole region for this little California-based startup, Glasspoint Solar. So it was an incredible change, right? It was like this, from this organization of, I think at the time there were 125,000 people, to being the first guy to start up an office in Oman. Did that for 4 years. We built what's now a 300, it was originally going to be 1,000 megawatt solar project, ended up being about a third of that, but still the biggest thermal solar project in the world that delivers steam to industry. So, and then I working on similar projects in California and under my own steam, and then worked on a big data startup in the Bay Area. So then I joined OGCI, and now what I do is I'm the interface between, we've invested now, I think we're approaching 20 ventures we've invested in our portfolio, and I'm the person that basically interfaces between all those and industry, all of our member companies and oil and gas industry and other stakeholders. So I'm basically the cheerleader for all of our investments, right? But I'm also trying to work on some strategic projects to make things go faster, right? So that's what I do, and we are trying to meet and exceed the goals of the COP21 agreement and decarbonize. So
very good. I would so two thoughts, two questions sort of came up, Daniel. The first is I had a colleague at Chevron who was talking about the challenge of looking at small technology companies when you're a multi-billion-dollar operation. Yeah. And his question was, scale. When a large organization, a billion-dollar corporation, $100 billion corporation looks at something and they think about small, they're thinking about something like that $100 million or $500 million. And on the other hand, you've got technology companies who are starting out, and to them, $10 million is a lot of money. So how do I'm assuming you're part of bridging that gap.
Absolutely.
What we would call the funding gap if you're on the small end of the scale, or is this really going to move the needle if you happen to be on the large end of the scale? How do you bridge that gap?
So I think that's a great question, and I think if you would ask that question 25 years ago, everyone would have said it wasn't possible. But what we've seen, say, with companies like Tesla's always a great example, or SpaceX or whatever, but not just Musk Enterprises, but there's a lot of companies who've taken the Silicon Valley venture capital model and applied it to other industries and done it successfully. And if you have a technology that can fundamentally scale, the building blocks of it are solid and can be replicated, then you can bring in a lot of venture capital and private equity, and you can scale a small company to be a very big company in a short time. And I don't think that was possible, or that was even seen, in industry for a while. But now that's very much something you can do. However, I will say that when you talk to people who've mainly been in the entrepreneurial small company environment, they don't speak the same language as large companies. So that interface between, say, Chevron and one of our smaller portfolio companies, there is a sort of translation you have to do. Make sure that they understand each other.
You're the universal translator. So
because I've done both, right? So it's like the small ventures need to their primary thing is get the next deal before we run out of money, right? That's kind of what you have to do. Whereas the big companies are, don't do something that's going to get me fired, is generally how a bigger company thinks, right?
Understood.
So it's a very different mentality.
Good. So this is probably a good moment to sort of touch on OGCI. What is OGCI? I know you've got some a deck that you present and give us sort of a perspective on it. My initial run through, and I have to say I spent maybe 15 minutes on the internet, is I'm actually really blown away at how much effort is being put into this by firms that you would typically consider to be on the other side of the fence. And so to see this happening, and I mean, most of us are aware of BP's efforts because they were probably the bellwether of trying, or the canary in the coal mine of sort of getting started in this transition. It's very impressive to see the industry as a whole starting to take on a more serious position of moving things in this arena. So I'm going to hand it over to you, Daniel. Tell us everything.
Yeah, so it's interesting your comments on different side of the fence. So I would say in some countries there is no fence. Everyone's on the same side, or everyone's on the same side of the fence, right? I think America is kind of a little bit unique in how big the fence is on climate change in the two sides. But, you know, our OGCI was originally founded by the European major oil companies. So, you know, the Total, Shell, BP, Eni, Repsol, Equinor. And, you know, I think in Europe, there's less of a political divide on that. But at the same time, Europe is not really a big oil producer. They're a consumer, right? And so it's a slightly different, you know, argument. So let me share. I've got a few slides. I'll try not to be too, not to do death by PowerPoint, but it's always good to try and illustrate what we are talking about. So good stuff. All right, can you see that?
Affirmative.
Yeah. So basically our organization came up following the Paris Climate Agreement, and the CEOs of I think originally, you know, the Europeans got together and said, look, we need to get aligned on this. We need to do something. So that was how we were founded. And so our organization is actually two organizations. There's a group which is basically a CEO initiative to accelerate change within their own organizations and get aligned on the critical issues related to decarbonization. And then following on from that, all of those companies then gave a commitment to invest in a fund called OGCI Climate Investments, which is who I work for. And we're about a 1.3 billion and growing fund dedicated to decarbonization. And we really focus in investing in low carbon solutions and technologies. We do both project and venture investing. I would say the majority is ventures at the moment. And we also then aim to implement those solutions within our own member group, right? So we're not just investing, we're also trying to use that and bring it back and adopt it within our member companies. And we're basically very focused on global change. So we're not just a European and North American. We have members, you know, have Saudi Aramco, Petrobras. You know, we work closely with CNPC and, you know, all over the world. So we focus on, you know, what are the big sectors, right? So if you look at where does the carbon in the atmosphere come from at the moment, right? You know, we look at it in terms of end use. So first of all, you know, production of energy is emitting about 11% of world's CO2 budget. So making the whole production and distribution leaner and lower in carbon footprint is really important. We focus on that. You've got industrial. So industrial is really dominated by cement, steel, and petrochemicals. And then transportation, you know, building, heating and cooling buildings, and then agriculture, forestry is actually a big one as well, right? People, you know, fertilizer and land use changes are a big factor in climate change. But we've chosen to invest in three areas, right? So reducing methane emissions from oil and gas. You've probably heard quite a bit about this, there's been a lot of press on it in the last year. And that's really a huge focus of what I do, right? I spend most of my time on that one. Also reducing CO2 emissions from industrial and energy applications, and then carbon capture and storage. There's been a lot of big announcements on that. You saw another big announcement, I think today, from Exxon. So there's really that solution is really starting to gain momentum, and we've been a big part of encouraging that both through technology and project investment, right? So that's what we work on. So number one is reducing methane emissions. Just a real quick, what do we do? So first thing is finding where those leaks are coming from, right? So we've got drones and aircraft and satellite. You know, we've launched GHGSat's one of our portfolio companies. They're on their third satellite now. It was the last one was launched by SpaceX in January. Goal is to have a constellation of 12 satellites tracking methane all over the world. and figuring out how to fix it. And then various other companies that Q Energy that addresses methane emissions from valves, and Clark valves similar, and automation. So work a lot on that. I can talk a bit more about that. Then efficiency, really. So anything to do with efficiency. So anything shipping, trucking, engines, electrification, building efficiency, and then reducing emissions from concrete and cement as well, and steel, right? So all those big industrial sectors. So I'll just pick two out just at random, right? So Norse Power is a rigid sails that go on ocean-going cargo vessels that can reduce emissions by about 10 to 15% by using kind of wind assistance on large, heavy shipping, bulk tankers and things like that. And then 75F is basically smart buildings, but very smart buildings. So basically you control each vent in the building using artificial intelligence and blow the right amount of hot air and cold air into the right part of each room. And a very, very smart way of doing that. They just won the Bloomberg. So out of these guys, 75F and OnTruck just won the Bloomberg New Energy Finance Energy Pioneers of the Year last week, right at the Bloomberg conference. So they're all doing very well. And then carbon capture and sequestration, right? So we've started in sort of two different ways. So first of all, figuring out where are the big industrial hubs where we can build public-private partnerships to sequester CO2. So the first one we worked on is really the sort of founding project for OGCI was one in Teesside, and that's been named now as Teesside Net Zero. And if you're interested, there's a great website, you can see what they're doing. Basically, the entire industrial hub of the northeast of England will have the option of connecting into this CO2 network, which will then be compressed and pumped and disposed of offshore in a deep aquifer. So that will be things like it's already a very industrial region, so petrochemicals, ammonia, things like that, and power generation would all go into that. So a lot of critical technology needs there. There are some basic processes for doing this already, but there's lots of room for optimization, right? So you take any source of CO2 from combustion, and you can you strip the CO2 out of the flue gas going up the chimney, basically, and you make CO2, you compress it, and then you dispose of it. But you can also use it, right? There are some, we use CO2 in certain processes, and there are new technologies like Solidia as a cement that's cured with CO2 instead of being cured with water. So there are some quite interesting applications there. But the main volume will be disposed of in storage. So the main application will be to then compress it and pump it, 5,000 feet underground, and it'll be permanently stored in aquifers. And a big project in Teesside. We're also involved in Elk Hills in California, and there are lots of other projects around the world we're looking at. So this area is suddenly really starting to gather momentum, right? It's been a while coming. Had some false starts back in the sort of 2000, 2005 time, but as long as there's a financial incentive for it to be done, then it can be done technically, right? So, yeah.
Daniel, I just wanted to step in. Did want to remind people there is room in the chat for questions.
Yeah.
And I've got a question from Stephen. I just thought it was appropriate since we touched on both CH4 and CO2 as greenhouse gas. Stephen's wondering, how do they compare? Is one dominant, or are they sort of 50-50, or from the perspective?
That's a very good question. So it depends how you calculate it. So I think using the 100-year global warming potential, methane is about 25 times more potent than CO2 in 20 years. Mm-hmm. And that means that by that measure, methane is responsible for about sort of 15% of warming today. However, methane has a very high short-term forcing factor, right? So it's on the 20-year time scale, it's actually 80 times more potent than CO2. So if you look at it from that perspective, depending on how you calculate it, it's almost half, in some measures, almost half of the warming we see from emissions today immediately is coming from methane, right? So in the short term, methane is really important, and that's bad news and good news.
Right.
It means that, you know, we are emitting more in the short term. We're warming the planet more in the short term than some people believe because of this short term impact of methane. On the other hand, if we stop emitting methane, it decays very quickly. So that most of it will be gone in 12 years if we stop and really cut down on methane. So we have the opportunity to reduce that warming impact significantly, right? Okay. As we were joking at the beginning, my dog will start barking if there's a FedEx truck, and the FedEx truck just pulled up outside my house. So if the dog starts barking, I apologize. So methane is very important in the short term, and so that's why we are very focused on it. The other thing about methane is it's actually not that expensive a problem to fix, right? Methane, let me go back. Methane is we're basically leaking methane into the atmosphere, right? We're leaking from upstream oil and gas. We're leaking from waste management facilities. We're leaking from agriculture, dairies, things like that. About an equal proportion of each, right? It's not that expensive to fix, right? We can, you know, we have the technology. Just requires a lot of focus. You have to know who's emitting and where you're emitting from, yeah, it's a solvable problem, right? So yeah.
So I've got a follow-on question, and that's the cost of capturing and storing CO2. You know, ballpark number, or what kind of would you use for measuring that?
That's a good one. So in the best case, it can be quite low. So there are a lot of processes where CO2 comes out in quite a concentrated form. So when you're making ethanol, it comes out in a concentrated form. If you're processing natural gas, it comes out as a virtually pure stream of CO2. And then it can be very cheap, right? I mean, you know, $20 a ton, maybe as low as that. When you have to sequester it from a high concentration source like coal power station or a blast furnace or a cement factory, it'll be almost 20% CO2 in the flue gas stream, so virtually no oxygen and all CO2. And stripping that out, maybe $50 a ton. When you go to a gas-fired power station with a lot of air going through, the CO2 may be only 4% of the stream, and then proportionally it gets more expensive as the CO2 gets more dilute in the flue gas. So I would say 50 to 100 today with today's technology is probably a reasonable range. So that's a kind of price on that.
Great. We are getting a number of questions in the chat room, but I wanted to give you, Daniel, a chance to run through the rest of your deck, and then we can. We've got a couple topics to explore, and we've got some questions to answer, which are generally falling in the category of the OGCI investment process and making a business case for doing some of the projects that you're working on. So
So just finishing off, these are two examples of the project. So, you know, I think anyone who's interested, go on the Net Zero Teesside website. This one is going to be about 3 to 5 million tons of CO2 a year sequestered, and it'll be starting mid-decade. And 5 of our members are separately. So we were a founding investor. We got it through front-end engineering and permitting and everything, and then now it's going towards, you know, final investment and really start to put in the serious capital, right? And then there's one in California. We're just a minority investor in it, but it's Elk Hills Power with CRC. So they're going to they have a gas-fired power station, they're going to capture the CO2 and use it for inject it into the reservoir, and they'll get a benefit in enhanced oil recovery, but also the CO2 will remain in the reservoir. So those are two examples of carbon capture and sequestration. And that was really it for my presentation. And then I have a bunch more slides on data and what's going on in the world, and I can use those in the discussion to kind of highlight where things are going. So,
well, thank you, Daniel, and obviously this is a very, very big topic. There's a lot of good questions in the chat, and we will try and be efficient and effective with our time remaining. We had talked about 3 topics to explore. One is the net zero concept. One is, what does the term industrial mean when you're looking at decarbonization? And then, a look at clean tech investing. And in particular, I think if you can put the spin on how OGCI looks at investments, that will help give our audience an idea of how do you look at this stuff. And we pride ourselves in Santa Barbara with lots and lots of very good ideas, and lots of good, what we consider to be good opportunities. I'd be interested to know whether OGCI looks at our opportunities in as positive a light as we do. So so let's take on net zero to begin with, and back to you.
Yeah, so net zero pledges weren't even a thing 2 years ago now, right? And now a number of our members have already made 2050 net zero or 2060 net zero commitments for their scope 1 and scope 2. So that's their own power consumption, and then all their own emissions, and then all their utility and services that they purchase. And some are also looking at offsets and decarbonizing their actual fuel and power that they deliver. And so looking at scope 3, like drastic reductions in scope 3 as well, which is what they sell. So we have a whole host of net zero among our member companies. We have a lot of countries that are pledging to net zero. Net zero's challenging, right? It involves deep decarbonization of things that are not just, anything you can do with electricity and relatively modest amounts of energy storage can be done, quite easily. I wouldn't say, easy is a relative term, right? Still massive investment, but things like, if you look at a national level net zero, you've got heavy industry, right? So steel and cement and petrochemicals are huge, and so that's where we see carbon capture and sequestration really coming in.
Right. We
know we can decarbonize, say, passenger vehicle transportation with electric cars, but when you sit in Santa Barbara, we see all the container ships coming from China, right? Those can't be electrified, right? It's just, the range is just impossible, right? So what are we going to do about those, right? So maybe hydrogen, ammonia, or offset with carbon sequestration, right? So, so those are the kind of things you have to start thinking about for a true net zero. It's not just net zero electricity, it's net zero everything.
Right. So what I'm hearing, Daniel, is some of the easy pickings are getting picked, and then we're going to run into a wall of, here's the real challenge.
Yeah, so I would say yes and no. So I work on a lot of projects in developing world, right? So related to the energy sector. There's places where we're still flaring gas, right? There's places where where we're still doing some kind of crazy things as a species, right? And there are there's still a lot of low-hanging fruit, right? There's still coal-fired power stations, things like that, right? So there are a lot of things that are an enormous challenge as well. But I don't think any of them, there's very few of them that we don't have a solution. I would say like passenger aircraft is probably the hardest thing to to eliminate carbon from, right? To do that is probably the most difficult. And, that'll probably be zero carbon fuels like synthetic fuels and some carbon offset mechanism.
Right.
But there's nothing I don't think there's anything that can't be done, but we're just talking about a lot of commitment and a lot of investment, right?
Right.
But let me show you, I'm going to show you one slide that's a little bit of a shocker. Let me present again. And it's playing games with me. Okay. Let's go. So I'm moving off my corporate slides, and I'm just sharing some stuff that is, if you're interested, there's an excellent report by the UN Environmental Programme on the gap, right? So what are we doing versus what do we need to do? So there's nothing to do with OGC. I'm just using this data to illustrate kind of for Earth Day what kind of challenges we're talking about. So there we go. So if you look at this, I don't know if you can see this. Hope you can see this slide. So these are the different pathways for emissions. So today we emit about 50 billion, so 55 billion tons of CO2 equivalent between CO2 and methane, right? If the current policies that are implemented in the world is this blue line here, this is the trajectory. We're going to keep increasing emissions until 2030, right? So if you look at the last round, COP21, the Paris Accord, there was an unconditional commitment to this orange line. And then there was a conditional commitment, like, yes, we're going to try and do this, if and but, to get to this red line by 2030, right? However, to get to 2 degrees, we actually need to be on this 2 degree, this light blue line here. And you can see the gap in the rate of change of emissions is just phenomenal. And to get to 1.5 degrees, we need to be on this green line down here. And what that means is, according to the UN, we're off by gigatons, right? We're talking about the difference between the unconditional NDC and a 1.5 scenario of 30 gigatons. So almost half of the emissions would have to be gone by 2030 to stay at 1.5 degrees, and a quarter of them would have to be eliminated by 2030 to get onto a 2 degree trajectory, right? Obviously, some pretty wide uncertainty bands shown in this chart, but that just gives you an idea of like everything we're doing today needs to go a lot faster if we're to meet the 2 degree goals, right? So, and that's obviously a global challenge. It has to happen everywhere. It has to happen in all states. And the same report shows emissions by country. So if you look at what's happened in the last 20 years, well, it's the ascent of China, right? So China now has the biggest emissions of any country by far. US and Europe is still high, but we're on a relatively steady downward trajectory, and China growing very fast and somewhat less from India. But obviously per capita, we're still the highest emitters by far, right? So we win that prize still. And you can see, even countries like, so a place like Europe with a relatively high standard of living are managing to push their emissions down to less than half of what our emissions are per capita.
Right. So well, I like the trend line for the US. I do.
Exactly. Yeah.
This isn't a race we want to win. So,
yeah.
Okay, good. Let's say, how about talking about the investment process that OGCI utilizes? Yeah, so we invest for impact. So we make an assessment of what the not just the company, but what the sector can do, right? Because we want to try and drive change not within the company we invest in, but within that kind of whole ecosystem.
So we look at that. We're looking for sort of millions of tons of impact. If it's not millions of tons, then it's not really an investment for us. And
you're looking for scalable solutions.
Scalable solutions in an industry that matters, right? We wouldn't look at sort of popcorn industry or something, right? It has to be steel, cement, industrial, heavy industry in large quantities, right? We do have we do like to try and look after our own emissions first, so we're very focused on emissions from oil and gas, right? Particularly methane. And we look globally. We look for things where we're not early stage, right? We're scale up stage. So we like to see that the thing's working. It can work. Mm-hmm. It can be economic, but it needs significant capital to scale. And then we tend to come in and stay in and follow on and stay with the company and try and help them grow as much as we can. So that's kind of our investment. And we as you said, we're quite narrow within those three groups, methane, CO2 reduction, and CCUS. That's really we don't invest in there's plenty of other companies and funds investing in renewable energy and things like that, battery storage and stuff. We haven't invested in that because we feel there's plenty of capital going into that already. Got it.
Cheryl, I'm presuming that has given you at least some answer on OGCI's investment approach, the sweet spot, the stage. Average investment size, Daniel, what do you typically deploy when you're putting money into these things?
It depends, sort of 5 million and up.
Okay.
As an initial round, that kind of size. Generally, but it could go, it really depends. We've got a pretty wide range depending on the stage and the capital requirements.
Got it.
So, yeah.
All right. I'm looking at, very good. Series C and above. Got it. Okay. One of the questions coming from the floor has to do with conflicts of interest between sponsors.
Yeah.
Do you see that?
So we're kind of independent. We have a board that's from our member companies. So there's a first thing we do is we're extraordinarily careful that we don't exchange information that could be anti-competitive, right? So we're very, very, we're extremely diligent on that. So we don't share stuff that would be of competitive advantage to any of our members. We're a fund, Climate Investments is a fund. We invest to make sure we get a return. We wouldn't do anything that is, that would be problematic to our members, but at the same time, we do things that, maybe not everybody is totally aligned with, right? So we always have, we have our own guidelines and we invest accordingly. So, but it hasn't been, we have great alignment from, this thing was started by the CEOs, and we have great alignment on the things we invest in, right? It's, those three areas give us plenty of targets, right? And we don't have to go outside of them.
And these are industry players who have a long history of doing joint ventures. I remember discussions when the majors were looking at going into Russia and taking on some of the risks of investing there. And you'd have a lead player, but then you'd have 2 or 3 other people. And of course, when you're dealing with billion-dollar chips, it's nice to have a few friends along with you. Good. So we've got a question in regards to the commitment of the members of OGCI to decarbonization. And so I know, from reading the website, there seems to be a commitment, but you probably have to deal with sort of the public optics of, why do these guys care? So talk to us about that.
So I think everybody understands in the industry that things are changing, have changed, right? It's not that they're changing, they've changed. And every country in the world is pretty much aligned on decarbonization towards some future net zero goal, right?
Right.
And so all of our members understand that they have to operate within those policy frameworks, right? So these are things that have to be done, right? I don't think so. I think there's pretty good commitment to those things, and you've seen the likes of the Europeans in particular, but some of the Americans now, investing in huge offshore wind projects. So that's really as in California, really solar has been the big driver behind decarbonizing the grid. In Northern Europe, it's offshore wind, right? So Equinor and BP and Shell have been putting multi-billion-dollar investments into offshore wind. So you can see the commitment in the scale of the investments. Now, the question I think is, how quickly does oil and gas demand fall, right? I think that's what's that downward trajectory look like? I think that's a very valid question. I think if you get that wrong, you invest in the wrong sector, right? So it's understanding that pace of change is quite important. And people have a different view on that, right?
They do. There are quite a few different opinions out there.
Yeah.
I think one of the outstanding questions for the group, we would like your perspective on what can I do? What can I as an individual do? And we're coming up on the end of our conversation. So I figured I'd give you a couple minutes, 5 minutes, to sort of explore, what are some takeaways for our audience to get from this conversation?
Yeah. So I think being a educated citizen is important, right? And avoid the kind of extreme points that don't really help, right? I mean, we're all in this together. We are decarbonizing, but at the same time, it's not going to happen overnight, right? And everyone has to understand that. I think being a voice of reason in the political environment as to how do we do this, right? But it does require an enormous amount of capital, right? It really is. I mean, it's trillions of dollars a year for the next 20 years. So it's going to take government has to point in the right direction for this to be successful. So there's that sort of citizenship thing about that. Personally, I mean, the top 1%, we do emit, just as we have more of everything, we emit more carbon than anybody, right? And we're a significant, I think the top 1% on the planet emit the same as the bottom 50%. So it's a little bit like income and wealth, right? So there's a big disparity. So, look at your carbon footprint and do take some, I think it is really valuable when people sort of vote with their wallet on, install solar. If you don't have solar on your roof, you really should, right? I mean, it's critical. I know some of you guys drive electric cars. You drive hydrogen fueled cars. Those things do matter, right? Because look at the cost decline. The fact that the guys that bought the expensive electric and hydrogen cars actually financed R&D and brought us the cheaper electric cars, right? So those things matter. Energy efficiency really matters, right? Do you have a really inefficient, is there something inefficient in your house, the insulation, the furnace or whatever, replacing that, upgrading, it's a good investment, right? I think all those things are worth doing, and a lot of people, fly less, eat less beef, and invest in things, right? Invest in things that I know you guys see lots of small projects coming up, renewable energy, bio waste, whatever, waste to energy, waste to something. Those are all good things to do, right? So, look for things that really make it. I always look at things read Bill Gates's book as well. That's the best way. It's a great book, the Avoiding a Climate Catastrophe. Very balanced and well written, I think. So he's got some good ideas in there. I was going to say one other thing was one of the questions we didn't really touch on, I don't think, we talked a little bit about investing, but, we talked about this when we chatted last week. Last time around, green tech investing didn't go so well, right? So if you look at the returns from the first round, say 10 years ago, there was a bit of false start, and I don't think that the right things were invested in and the policies weren't really in place. But I do believe it's different this time. If you look at the scale of commitment and growth, I think clean tech investing, whether it's renewables or what we're doing, CCUS, methane reduction, these are all going to happen now. So if you pick the right companies, there are going to be returns. It's not like a software business where it happens overnight, but it is happening faster and with higher certainty than last time. So
very good. Well, thank you. So we have a request in regards to your guitars. And we're just, we've got a few minutes. If you picked one of your favorite guitars and played us something, I'm sure that this would make this particular conversation unique.
Okay. I will do. I will. Is there any other questions before I have to think for a moment about what I'm going to play? And they may not be in tune, right? So it may not be. It may not be.
But we've got to, so many of us, for example, myself, I'm interested in sustainable agriculture. And we had one question that had to do with, let's go all the way back to Linda LeBrock, where they've got a fuel cell project utilizing organic waste from from onions. I'm assuming this may not be specific to something OGCI might invest in, although agriculture is a pretty big generator of methane. I'm just curious on your take for this type of innovation.
Yeah, so I don't think we would invest in something like that just because of scale. That there wouldn't be enough onions to be scalable, right? But the bio waste, from agriculture, like I think if and this is my personal opinion, I'm not speaking on behalf of OGCI. I'm quite like biofuels. I struggle with because turning arable a cropland over to growing fuel, some level just increases food prices, and I don't necessarily believe it's a good idea. But using the waste from agriculture to develop biofuels, I think, is a good idea, right? I mean, it does have a lot of potential. So anything that wastes to something, I mean, I know in California there's some big projects on dairy digesters to methane, and those are phenomenal projects because otherwise that stuff rots, emits methane. That's 20% of our methane budget is coming from rotting, agricultural waste. So, so there are some great projects out there, and it's going to take all kinds, right?
Got it. Super. I want to extend a very heartfelt thank you, Daniel, for your time today. Daniel will be joining us for our post-conversation soiree, where we all get to drink our glass of water and further and discuss both what's in front of us with decarbonization and so much more. And so I'm going to save the guitar playing until the soiree. Thank you.
Oh, there you go. There you go. It's part of this.
But we do have one last question. This is from John Steed, and the reason I'm mentioning it because it is such a interesting question, and it has to do with: do we need to put a price on emissions?
Yes.
Is there a market?
Yes.
Okay. So
yes. No, there has to be a price on carbon, right? I mean, if you look at it worldwide, and I had a map, I won't present it, but there's a lot of countries that now have a price on carbon. It has to be a price, and it has to be a price that you can't kind of wiggle around, right? You have to probably have some kind of border adjustment for countries that don't have a price. So if you have a price and your neighbor doesn't have a price, he's going to get all the heavy industry and you're going to get all the unemployment, right? So you have to have a price, and it has to be fairly global, and it has to be with some border adjustments for people who don't play fair.
There needs to be a market to handle that.
And it probably needs to be, above where it is now, right? I mean, the emissions trading in the EU is like 35 euros a ton. That's probably not quite high enough. It doesn't need to be super high. I mean, I think, we have a lot of solutions in the sort of $50 to $100 range that can be scaled to a massive size. So right. I believe it'll land, if you had some kind of, something in that range, it would sort of 40 to 100 or 40 to 80 would probably do a lot. There's a lot of projects that can be done. If you look at California, we have LCFS at $200 a ton, and that's what's stimulating all this carbon capture and utilization in the state. So it needs to be a price, needs to be reasonably high, needs to be certainty is more important than the actual price as well, right? It has to be solid so that I can, that people can go invest 20-year projects, right? Not just this year and next year. So that's the key thing. And I think, all of our members have advocated for that. I think, there is a cost, right? And if you look, we're going to have to go from investing about $1 trillion a year in we used to invest in fossil fuel development, and we're going to have to invest far more than that, maybe 2 trillion or 3 trillion a year in a decarbonized world, probably. So there's going to be a price on carbon, but it's not, it's not an unbearable price, right? It's not that high, right? I think that's one of the things. It is doable. It's a few percent of GDP. It's not onerous,
right?
So there is a way, there is a pathway to do this.
Very good. Well, again, Daniel, and echoing many of the comments from the chat room, thank you very much for joining us. Do appreciate your insights, intelligence, and leadership in this arena. I want to extend a special thank you to our program committee, Stephen, Jonathan, and Linda, for pulling this conversation together. Always fun to learn something, isn't it, guys? And I think now I need somebody to point me in the direction of where is this soiree? Where are we going now? Linda, what's next?
So there's a link for the after party. So quickly gather your tea or afternoon beverage of choice and hop onto the second link that was sent.
Okay.
If anybody doesn't have it, shoot me an email or text. Here, I'll put my, and just put my, here's my phone if you want to, if you need that.
Thanks again for inviting me, and pleasure to join, and pleasure to be involved in the Santa Barbara community on this.
Thank you very much, Daniel. See you in a moment.
I'll see you in a moment.
Stephen, do you have anything you want to add?
Oh, it was fantastic. Thank you so much, Daniel. And we'll see you in the after event room in just a minute.
Right.
Very good. Thank you, everyone. Have a great afternoon.